Every parent knows the pain of watching their child go hungry. But Martha Caldwell never imagined she'd be standing in a bakery, swallowing her pride to ask for expired cake just to see her little girl smile. In the small town of Hollow Ridge, Martha pushed open the bakery door with her 8-year-old daughter, Sarah. They hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The sweet smell of fresh bread filled the air as Martha approached the counter. "Do you have any expired cake for my daughter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before the baker could answer, the door opened again. A tall man in a white hat walked in. This was Elias Boone, the wealthy cattle rancher who had left town 20 years ago after losing his own daughter. When Boone looked at little Sarah, he saw something that stopped him cold. She had the same blue eyes as his daughter, who had died of fever all those years ago. What happened next changed everything. What would you do if you had the power to help your child and heal your own broken heart at the same time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn leather journal sat heavy in Elias Boone's coat pocket as he stood frozen in the doorway of Miller's Bakery, watching the scene unfold before him. 20 years of running from grief had brought him full circle to this moment, face to face with a child whose cornflower blue eyes carried the same spark of innocence he'd lost forever on a fever-ravaged night in 1883. Hollow Ridge had withered since his departure. Like a flower denied water, the once thriving railroad town now bore the scars of economic hardship, peeling paint on storefronts, cracked sidewalks where weeds pushed through concrete, and the hollow look in people's eyes that spoke of dreams deferred too long. Main Street stretched before him like a testament to broken promises, each boarded window a reminder of prosperity that had packed up and moved on when the railroad chose a different route through the mountains. Henry Miller, the baker, stood behind his counter with flour-dusted hands and kind eyes that had witnessed too much sorrow in recent years. His wife Clara emerged from the kitchen, wiping her palms on a checkered apron that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. They were good people, the kind who gave their last loaf to a hungry neighbor and worried more about their community than their profit margins. Martha Caldwell clutched her daughter's hand with the fierce protection of a mother who had already lost too much. Her simple dress was clean, but showed the telltale signs of careful repair patches sewn with precise stitches, a hem let down to accommodate years of wear. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to bear burdens without complaint. But her eyes held shadows that spoke of nights spent worried and sleepless. Her late husband, Thomas, had been a good man, a carpenter, who built sturdy homes and believed in honest work for honest pay. The lung fever that took him left Martha with medical bills that consumed their modest savings and a daughter to raise on seamstress wages that barely covered rent. She'd sold everything of value except her wedding ring and her mother's china, keeping those sacred relics as anchors to better times. Little Sarah possessed that particular brand of resilience found in children, who matured too quickly but somehow retained their wonder. Her faded blue ribbon, a gift from her father before his passing, held back honey-colored hair that caught the morning sunlight streaming through the bakery windows. Despite the hunger gnawing at her small stomach, she gazed at the displays of bread and pastries with curiosity rather than desperate longing, trusting in her mother's promise that everything would somehow work out. The bakery itself served as Hollow Ridge's unofficial heart, where news traveled faster than the morning coffee, and Clara Miller dispensed advice along with her cinnamon rolls. The wooden floors creaked familiar songs beneath the feet of customers who had walked these planks for decades, and the glass cases reflected countless stories of community. Celebration birthday cakes for children who had since grown and moved away. Wedding cakes for couples who had weathered life's storms together, but prosperity had abandoned Hollow Ridge like a faithless lover. When the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad chose the northern route through, Silverton, instead of pushing through their mountain pass, the town's future derailed along with their economic dreams. The silver mine played out 6 months later, and one by one, families packed their belongings and chased opportunity elsewhere. Those who remained were bound by stubborn love for the land, family obligations, or simply the lack of means to start over somewhere new. They formed a tight community born of shared hardship, where neighbors knew each other's struggles and victories with intimate familiarity. When the Hendersons lost their farm to drought, the whole town pitched in to help them plant a kitchen garden. When old Mrs. Patterson broke her hip, Clara Miller organized meal deliveries that continued for 3 months without fanfare. Elias Boone had once been their golden son, the ambitious young man who'd partnered with railroad investors to bring prosperity to his hometown. His cattle operations stretched across 3 valleys, and his vision of Hollow Ridge as a major shipping hub had captured everyone's imagination. He'd married Elizabeth Hartwell in the town's grandest wedding, and their daughter Catherine had been the apple of everyone's eye. But grief had a way of poisoning even the strongest foundations. When scarlet fever swept through the territory in the winter of 1883, it took his 3-year-old Catherine, along with a dozen other souls. Elizabeth, unable to bear the loss, had retreated into a melancholy so profound that she stopped speaking, stopped eating, and simply faded away like morning mist. Boone had buried his wife 6 months after his daughter, sold his cattle empire to the highest bidder, and disappeared into the Colorado wilderness like a ghost, seeking peace. The fortune he'd accumulated sat largely untouched in Denver banks, earning interest while he lived like a hermit in a mountain cabin, sustained by hunting and fishing, and the occasional supply run to distant settlements where no one knew his story. His leather journal contained 20 years of entries, letters never sent to a daughter who would never read them, confessions of regret, and dreams of the family gatherings that would never happen. Now, standing in Miller's bakery, he watched Martha's internal struggle with the clarity of someone who understood pride's terrible weight. Her shoulders squared with determination, even as her voice trembled with shame, and he recognized the moment when desperation finally overwhelmed dignity. Every parent reached that breaking point, the instant when their child's need mattered more than their own reputation. Henry Miller's response was immediate and generous. "Of course, Martha. Clara just pulled some apple turnovers from yesterday that are still perfectly good. Sarah, would you like to pick which ones look best?" But before the transaction could complete, Boone found himself stepping forward, his voice rusty from years of limited conversation. "How much for everything in the bakery?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, unexpected and slightly dangerous. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him, Martha's filled with confusion, Sarah's with innocent curiosity, and the Millers with the careful assessment of people who'd learned to be wary of strangers bearing gifts. Clara Miller broke the silence first, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't believe we've been introduced." The formality felt strange after so many years of isolation, but Boone removed his white hat with practiced politeness. "Elias Boone, ma'am. I used to live here." Recognition dawned slowly across Henry's features, followed by something between surprise and wariness. "Elias Boone. Well, I'll be. We heard you'd. That is, we weren't sure. I've been away," Boone said simply, his eyes drifting back to Sarah, who was studying him with the open assessment of childhood. "But I'm back now, and I'd like to know what it would cost to buy your entire inventory for the day." Martha stepped protectively closer to her daughter, her maternal instincts triggered by the stranger's intense attention. "That's very generous, Mr. Boone, but we only need. Every child in this town should have cake," he interrupted, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even him. "And bread, and whatever else they need." The words emerged from a place deeper than conscious thought, drawn from 20 years of accumulated grief and a sudden, fierce desire to fill the empty spaces that loss had carved within him. In Sarah's bright eyes, He glimpsed an opportunity for redemption that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with healing. Wounds he'd carried too long. Henry and Clara exchanged the kind of meaningful look that passed between couples married long enough to communicate without words. They'd heard stories about Elias Boone's wealth, his mysterious departure, and the tragedy that had driven him from everything familiar. Now here he stood, older and quieter than memory suggested, offering to solve their community's hunger with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to making problems disappear. "Mr. Boone," Clara said carefully, "that's very kind, but we couldn't possibly accept such generosity from a stranger." "I'm not a stranger," he replied. And for the first time in 20 years, the words felt true. "I'm home." The silver pocket watch in Elias Boone's vest had stopped ticking at 11:47 on the night his daughter died, its hands frozen like his heart had been for 20 years. Now, as he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet thick with bills, time seemed to stutter back to life with the weight of decision. "Name your price," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as she pressed closer to her mother's worn skirt. "Henry." Miller's hands trembled slightly as he wiped flour from his palms, leaving white streaks on his apron. "Mr. Boone, I appreciate the offer, but we can't. $500. The sum fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward in silence. Clara Miller's hand flew to her throat, her fingers finding the simple cross that rested there. $500 represented more money than their bakery earned in 6 months, enough to pay their suppliers, fix the broken oven, and still have money left for winter preparations. Martha Caldwell's face flushed with a mixture of shame and confusion. She'd only asked for expired cake scraps that would otherwise feed the birds, and now this stranger was offering to buy out the entire bakery. "Sir, that's far too generous for what we need. Sarah and we only wanted—" "I know what you wanted," Boone interrupted gently, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that came from his own experience with pride and desperation. "But I'm asking for something different. I want to buy everything here, and I want you to help me distribute it." The request hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications none of them fully grasped. Sarah tugged at her mother's dress, her child's logic cutting through the adult complexities that paralyzed the conversation. "Mama, why is the nice man sad?" she whispered, but her voice carried in the bakery's stillness. The question pierced Boone like an arrow finding its mark. Children possessed an intuition that adults learned to ignore, and this little girl had seen straight through 20 years of carefully constructed walls to the grief that lived beneath. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, his weathered hands gentle as he spoke. "I am sad, little one. I lost someone very important to me, and I've been sad for a very long time." Sarah considered this with the solemn thoughtfulness of a child who had known loss herself. "My daddy died too. Mama says he watches over us from heaven." The words hit Boone with unexpected force, confirming what he'd suspected about Martha's circumstances and Sarah's resilience. Here was a child who understood grief but hadn't been crushed by it, who still believed in protection and love despite experiencing abandonment through death. "I'm sure he does," Boone managed, his voice rougher than intended. "And I think he'd want to make sure you always have enough to eat." Martha's protective instincts warred with her practical need as she watched this stranger connect with her daughter. Something in his manner, the careful way he spoke to Sarah, the genuine sorrow in his eyes suggested depths of character that wealth alone couldn't explain. Henry Miller cleared his throat, business instincts finally overriding his shock. "Mr. Boone, if you're serious about this offer, we'd need to discuss terms. The bakery inventory, the day's production. I'm serious." Boone stood, withdrawing his wallet and counting out bills with practiced efficiency. $500 for today's inventory, distributed free to any family that needs it. And I want to establish an account enough to ensure no child in this town goes hungry. The money appeared on the counter like physical proof of impossible dreams. Clara Miller touched one of the bills with trembling fingers, as if testing whether it might disappear like smoke. "Why?" Martha asked. The word emerging is barely more than breath. "Why would you do this for people you don't even know?" Boone's hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, where the stopped watch rested against his heart. The answer lay in 20 years of accumulated regret, and nights spent staring at mountain stars and wondering what his life might have been if he'd chosen healing over hiding. "Because I can," he said simply. "Because this is where I belong, and because that little girl has my daughter's eyes." The admission fell between them like a confession, raw and honest in a way that stripped pretense from the moment. Martha understood then that this wasn't charity or whim. This was a man trying to build bridges back to the living world, using the only tools he had left. Sarah, oblivious to the adult complexities swirling around her, had discovered a display case filled with sugar cookies shaped like stars and horses. Her small nose pressed against the glass, leaving a tiny fog print as she studied each one with the careful consideration of someone making an important choice. "Can I really pick anyone I want?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder at such unprecedented abundance. "You can pick 3, Boone said, surprising everyone, including himself. "One for now, one for later, and one to share with a friend." The generosity was overwhelming in its casual enormity. Martha felt tears threatening, the product of months of stress and worry finally finding release in the face of unexpected kindness. She'd grown accustomed to measuring every penny, to choosing between bread and milk, to telling Sarah they'd have treats another time when money was less tight. Clara Miller had already begun moving, her baker's instincts taking over as she started gathering items into baskets. "If we're going to do this properly, we'll need to organize distribution. There's the Henderson family and old Mrs. Patterson and—" "Make a list," Boone interrupted, pulling out additional bills. "Whatever it takes to reach everyone who needs help." Henry Miller studied the stranger who had once been their golden boy, trying to reconcile memory with reality. The young Elias Boone had been ambitious and confident, ready to conquer the world through sheer determination. This older version carried himself with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that the world could not be conquered, only endured, and perhaps occasionally redeemed. "There's talk of a railroad coming through again," Henry offered tentatively, testing whether business still held any appeal for their unexpected benefactor. New route through the southern pass could bring prosperity back to Hollow Ridge. Boone nodded absently, his attention focused on Sarah as she made her careful selections, each choice accompanied by serious deliberation. "Prosperity's good," he said, "but children shouldn't have to wait for trains to eat." The statement carried weight beyond its simple words, suggesting a philosophy shaped by loss and refined by solitude. Martha found herself studying this man who had appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice, wondering what combination of tragedy and generosity had brought him to their door at precisely the right moment. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "this is incredibly generous, but I need to understand, what do you want in return?" The question was fair and necessary, the product of hard-won wisdom about the cost of accepting help. But Boone's answer came without hesitation, carrying the simple truth of someone who had finally found his way home. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said. "Just let me help." The hand-carved wooden horse sat on Martha's kitchen table like a question mark made of pine and memories. Elias Boone had pressed it into Sarah's palm before leaving the bakery, claiming he'd whittled it years ago and forgot to give it away. But Martha recognized the careful attention to detail, the flowing mane, the proud stance, the tiny saddle edged with intricate patterns that spoke of countless evenings spent crafting love into wood. Sarah had named the horse Thunder and carried it everywhere for 3 days now. galloping it across windowsills and fence posts, while making soft neighing sounds that filled their small rented room with unexpected joy. For a child who owned few toys, this gift represented treasure beyond measure. But Martha's pleasure in her daughter's happiness was complicated by the weight of obligation that accompanied such generosity. In her experience, gifts this meaningful came with strings attached, expectations that emerged slowly like weeds growing through cracks in foundation stones. "Mama, can we go see Mr. Boone today?" Sarah asked, perched on their bed with thunder prancing between the patches of morning sunlight that filtered through their single window. "He's a busy man, sweetheart. Important people have important things to do." The deflection felt hollow even as Martha spoke it. Boone had spent the past 3 days moving through Hollow Ridge like a man on a mission, hiring locals for projects that seemed to multiply by the hour. He'd commissioned repairs to the schoolhouse roof, funded improvements to the church bell tower, and somehow convinced the reluctant town council to let him pay for new street lamps along Main Street. Word spread quickly in small towns, especially when that word involved mysterious strangers dispensing money like seed corn. By evening of the first day, half the town knew about the bakery incident. By the second day, everyone had theories about Boone's motivations, ranging from guilt over his long absence to preparation for some elaborate business scheme. Martha had listened to the speculation with growing unease during her afternoon seamstress work at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, where local women gathered to mend clothes and share gossip with equal enthusiasm. "Mark my words," declared Widow Spencer, her needle flashing through a torn seam with practiced efficiency. "No man throws money around like that without wanting something in return. My late husband always said generosity without explanation is manipulation with patience." Mrs. Patterson, ever diplomatic, offered a gentler perspective while adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles. "Perhaps he's simply trying to make amends for leaving us when times got hard. Some folks carry guilt differently than others." "Guilt, maybe," allowed Judith Henderson, whose family had received 2 loaves of fresh bread and a jar of preserves courtesy of Boone's bakery arrangement. "But what kind of man disappears for 20 years and thinks he can just buy his way back into people's hearts?" The question lodged in Martha's mind like a splinter. She'd seen genuine pain in Boone's eyes when he looked at Sarah, recognized the careful way he spoke to her daughter as someone unaccustomed to children but desperate not to cause harm. Yet wisdom earned through hardship warned against trusting appearances, especially when those appearances came wrapped in $100 bills. A soft knock at her door interrupted these uncomfortable thoughts. Martha opened it to find Henry Miller, hat in hand and expression serious despite the flour that still dusted his collar. "Martha, I hope I'm not intruding, but Mr. Boone asked me to deliver this." He handed her an envelope sealed with red wax, the paper thick and expensive. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal, revealing a letter written in careful script that suggested education and deliberate thought. "Dear Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you'll forgive the presumption of this correspondence, but I wanted to explain my actions at the bakery and address any concerns you might have about accepting help from a stranger. 20 years ago, I lost my daughter Catherine to scarlet fever. She was 3 years old, with blue eyes like Sarah's and the same curious spirit that sees wonder in simple things. When I saw your daughter in the bakery, I recognized something I'd thought was gone forever: the possibility that a man might still serve a purpose beyond his own grief. I don't offer charity, Mrs. Caldwell. I offer partnership. This town raised me, shaped me, and deserves better than the abandonment I gave it in my pain. But rebuilding requires more than money. It requires the kind of community, connections that women like you understand better than men like me ever could. If you're willing, I'd like to hire you to oversee the distribution of assistance to families in need. The position would pay $40 monthly, enough to secure better housing for you and Sarah. while ensuring that help reaches those too proud to ask for it directly. I realize this seems sudden, but time has taught me that opportunities for redemption don't announce themselves with warning bells. Sometimes grace arrives disguised as ordinary moments, a child's hunger, a mother's love, a stranger's chance to choose healing over hiding. If this proposal seems acceptable, please meet me at the church tomorrow after Sarah's school. We can discuss details and address any questions you might have about my intentions or capabilities. With respect and hope, Isla's Boompies. Please tell Sarah that Thunder was carved for a little girl who would have loved having such a wonderful friend to care for him. Martha read the letter twice, her heart racing with equal parts hope and fear. $40 monthly represented more money than she'd ever earned. Enough to move from their single rented room to a proper house with space for Sarah to play and privacy for Martha to think. But the personal revelation about his daughter added layers of complexity she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't random charity. This was a grieving father trying to fill the hole in his heart by helping another man's child. The recognition brought understanding, but also responsibility that felt heavier than gratitude. Good news? Henry asked, noting her expression's mixture of emotions. I'm not sure, Martha admitted honestly. He wants to hire me to help distribute aid to needy families. Henry nodded thoughtfully. Clara mentioned he'd asked about folks who might need assistance but wouldn't ask for it directly. Said he wanted someone with connections to handle things proper-like, without embarrassing anybody. The consideration impressed Martha despite her wariness. Someone who understood pride's role in small-town dynamics, possessed wisdom that couldn't be bought with money alone. What do you think of him, Henry? Really? The baker considered his words carefully, the way men did when asked to judge character rather than actions. I think he's a man carrying more pain than any person should have to bear alone. And I think maybe helping others might be the only way he knows how to help himself. The assessment felt true in ways that both comforted and concerned Martha. She wanted to believe in redemption and second chances, in the possibility that tragedy could transform into purpose rather than simply ending in bitterness. But she also needed to protect Sarah from the disappointment that came when broken people couldn't sustain the healing they sought through others. Love given from emptiness rarely lasted long enough to build the security that children required. The tattered wedding ring on Martha's finger caught the afternoon sunlight as she stood before the church where she promised to love Thomas Caldwell until death parted them. The simple gold band had grown loose over months of meager eating, but she twisted it nervously as she waited for Elias Boone, wondering if accepting his job offer represented betrayal or survival. Thomas had been a good husband, steady, kind, devoted to both his wife and daughter with the quiet consistency of a man who understood that love was built through daily choices rather than grand gestures. He'd worked with his hands, creating beauty from raw wood, and believed that honest labor was its own form of prayer. Martha still heard his voice sometimes in the early morning hours, gentle reminders about Sarah's need for stability and her own capacity for strength. You're stronger than you know, Martha, he'd whispered during those final fever-ravaged days. Promise me you'll let people help when help is offered. Pride's a luxury we can't afford when Sarah's future is at stake. Now, facing the possibility of steady income and proper housing, Martha felt the weight of that deathbed promise. Thomas had known that his passing would leave them vulnerable, dependent on community kindness and Martha's limited skills for survival. He'd have wanted her to accept Boone's offer. She knew this with certainty that felt like conversation across the veil between worlds. Sarah emerged from the schoolhouse, across the street, her honey-colored hair catching light as she skipped down the steps with Thunder clutched in one small fist. School had become the brightest part of her day since Mrs. Henderson started supplementing lessons with stories and songs that made learning feel like play rather than obligation. "Mama," Sarah called, her voice bright with excitement. "Mrs. Henderson says Mr. Boone fixed the roof so we won't get rained on anymore when storms come through." The genuine joy in her daughter's voice made Martha's decision easier. Sarah deserved stability, education, and the kind of childhood that wasn't shadowed by constant worry about rent and food. If Boone's offer provided those things, then Martha's pride was indeed a luxury they couldn't afford. Boone appeared around the church corner precisely on time, his punctuality suggesting military discipline, or simply the courtesy of someone who understood that other people's time held value. He traded his white hat for a simple brown one that made him look less like a cattle baron and more like an ordinary man seeking ordinary conversation. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Thank you for considering my proposal, Mr. Boone." Martha's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone still measuring trust against necessity. "I've read your letter several times. I have questions, of course." His eyes found Sarah, who was showing Thunder the church bell tower with the patient explanation children reserved for beloved toys. Would it be easier to talk privately, or would Sarah prefer to stay close? The consideration touched Martha unexpectedly. Most adults either ignored children completely or spoke around them as if they couldn't understand adult conversation. Boone seemed to recognize Sarah as a person whose comfort mattered in discussions that would affect her future. "Sarah can hear whatever we discuss," Martha said firmly. "She's learned to handle truth better than most adults handle uncertainty." Boone nodded with something that looked like approval. "Practical wisdom. I respect that." He gestured toward the church steps. "Shall we sit? I find important conversations go better when people can look each other in the eye." They settled on the wide stone steps that had welcomed 3 generations of Hollow Ridge families for weddings, funerals, and Sunday services. Sarah positioned herself between the adults, Thunder prancing along the step's edge as she listened to grown-up talk with the intense attention of children who've learned that adult decisions shape their world. "First question," Martha began. "Why me? You don't know anything about my capabilities or character." "I know you asked for expired cake to feed your child," Boone replied simply. "I know you chose humility over hunger when pride would have been easier. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The answer deflected rather than satisfied, but Martha appreciated its honesty. "Second question. What exactly would this job require?" Boone withdrew a folded paper from his coat, a list written in the same careful script as his letter. "I've identified 17 families in various stages of need. Some require assistance with food, others with housing repairs, medical expenses, or children's clothing. Your job would be assessing those needs discreetly and coordinating help in ways that preserve dignity." Martha scanned the list, recognizing every name and understanding immediately why discretion mattered. The Henderson family would accept help for their children, but refuse personal assistance. Mrs. Patterson needed medical care, but would never admit she couldn't afford the doctor. Each family required different approaches to receiving aid without losing face. "This is thoughtful work," she admitted. "But $40 monthly seems excessive for organizing charity." "It's not charity," Boone corrected gently. "It's community investment. And the salary reflects the job's true complexity. You'd be rebuilding the social connections that make a town worth saving." Sarah had been listening with the focused attention of children who understood that important things were being decided. Now she looked up at Boone with eyes that held both trust and curiosity. "Mr. Boone, are you going to be Sarah's new papa?" she asked with the directness that made adults uncomfortable and conversations honest. The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire, unexpected and slightly dangerous. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks as she prepared to explain that jobs and marriages were entirely different things. But Boone answered with the same careful honesty he'd shown throughout their conversation. "I'd be honored to be your friend, Sarah. As for anything else, that would be up to your mama, and it would happen slowly." with lots of talking and thinking first. The response satisfied Sarah while acknowledging Martha's autonomy in ways that impressed her despite her embarrassment. Here was a man who understood that relationships built properly require time and consent from all parties involved. "Third question," Martha said, pushing past the moment's awkwardness. "What happens if this arrangement doesn't work out? If the town doesn't accept your help, or if you decide to leave again?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered futures that might unfold. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of promises shaped by loss and tested by solitude. "I'm not leaving again. Mrs. Caldwell, I've spent 20 years running from home, and I'm too old and too tired to start over somewhere else. Whatever happens here, happens. But it happens with me staying put." The commitment felt solid in ways that surprised Martha. This wasn't the temporary enthusiasm of someone seeking quick redemption. This was the deliberate choice of someone who tried isolation and found it wanting. The faded photograph in Elias Boone's leather journal showed his late wife, Elizabeth, holding 3-year-old Catherine on a spring morning that might have been yesterday or a lifetime ago. Both wore white dresses and matching smiles, captured in a moment when their world still held promises instead of graves. He traced Elizabeth's face with a trembling finger as Sarah's fever flushed. Cheeks brought memories rushing back like floodwaters, breaking through a dam. 3 days into her new position managing Boone's charitable efforts, Martha had moved herself and Sarah into the small house behind the church, 2 rooms, a kitchen, and their own privy luxury beyond anything they'd known since Thomas's death. Sarah had been delighted with the space to spread her belongings and play with Thunder, without worrying about disturbing neighbors through thin walls. But tonight, as Martha pressed a cool cloth to her daughter's burning forehead, those improvements felt meaningless against the terror that seized every parent when fever spiked beyond reason. Sarah's temperature had climbed steadily since afternoon, her small body shaking with chills despite the blankets Martha had piled around her. "Mama," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with congestion. "My throat hurts." The complaint sent ice through Martha's veins. Throat pain, fever, and the red rash beginning to appear on Sarah's neck. She'd heard these symptoms described before in hushed conversations among women who'd lived through scarlet fever epidemics, the disease that had swept through the territory 20 years ago, taking children like autumn leaves stripped by wind. "I know, sweetheart. Just rest." Martha tried to keep panic from her voice, but her hands shook as she adjusted the cloth. She needed help, needed medicine, needed Dr. Morrison from 3 towns over, because, although Ridge's elderly physician had died 2 winters past, a knock at her door came like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. Martha opened it to find Boone standing in the lamplight, concern etched across features that looked older than his 50-some years. "Henry mentioned Sarah was feeling poorly," he said simply. "I thought you might need assistance." Relief flooded through Martha so completely that she sagged against the doorframe. "She's burning up. I think I'm afraid it might be scarlet fever," Boone finished quietly, understanding immediately why terror had replaced the careful composure Martha usually maintained. "May I see her?" Martha stepped aside, watching as Boone approached Sarah's bedside with the careful movements of someone who'd walked this path before. He knelt beside the small figure, his weathered hand gentle against her forehead as he checked her temperature with the practiced assessment of experience. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "Thunder told me you weren't feeling well." Despite her fever, Sarah managed a weak smile. "You can hear Thunder talk? Special horses speak to people who listen carefully." Boone's voice carried warmth that pushed back against the room's shadows. "He's worried about you." The conversation seemed to ease something in Sarah's labored breathing. But Boone's expression remained serious as he stood and motioned Martha toward the kitchen where they could speak privately. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "Since this afternoon." The fever came on fast, and now there's a rash. I'm writing for Dr. Morrison tonight. Boone interrupted, his decision already made. It's a hard 12-hour journey, but I can have him here by morning. Martha's heart leaped with gratitude and fear. The expense. I don't have money for a doctor's travel fees. That's not your concern. Boone was already reaching for his coat, his movements quick with purpose. I'll also bring medicine from Denver if Morrison doesn't have what's needed. Why? The question escaped before Martha could stop it. Why would you do this for us? Boone paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame as memories played across his features like shadows from firelight. Because 20 years ago, I watched my daughter die of scarlet fever while I stood helpless. I couldn't save Catherine, but maybe I can save Sarah. The admission hung between them raw and honest, stripping away pretense to reveal the desperate hope that drove his generosity. This wasn't about charity or community improvement. This was about a father trying to rewrite history through someone else's child. Mr. Boone Elias, Martha said softly, using his first name for the first time. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing. His voice carried quiet determination. Some chances don't come twice, Martha. Let me have this one. The vulnerability in his words touched something deep in Martha's chest. She'd been so focused on protecting herself and Sarah from disappointment that she'd forgotten some people needed to give help as desperately as others needed to receive it. Ride carefully, she whispered. Sarah needs you to come back. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, acknowledging for the first time that Boone had become important to both of them. He nodded once, then disappeared into the night like a man racing against ghosts that had haunted him too long. Martha returned to Sarah's bedside, settling into the chair she'd pulled close to monitor every breath. The little girl's hand sought hers in sleep, trusting in protection that felt fragile against the fever's heat. Mama's here, Martha murmured, though she wasn't sure if the comfort was for Sarah or herself. Mr. Boone's gone to fetch help. Everything's going to be all right. The promise felt hollow in the lamplight, made by a woman who'd already learned that death didn't respect love or hope or desperate bargaining. She'd lost Thomas despite prayers and fighting and refusing to accept defeat. Now she faced the possibility of losing Sarah too, and the thought brought a darkness that threatened to consume reason. But Boone's willingness to ride through the night for a child who wasn't his own offered a different kind of hope. Maybe love didn't always prevent loss, but perhaps it could summon help when help seemed impossible. Maybe one man's grief could become another family's salvation if he chose healing over hiding. Thunder sat on the bedside table, where Sarah had placed him, the wooden horse standing guard over dreams that flickered between fever and peace. Martha touched the careful carving, remembering Boone's words about creating it for a little girl who would have loved having such a wonderful friend. Now she understood the gift's true meaning, not just a toy for Sarah, but a bridge between past sorrow and present hope. Carved by hands that had learned to create beauty from remembering love rather than dwelling in loss. The child's quilt spread across Sarah's bed was a patchwork of love sewn from fabric scraps Martha had collected over months of careful saving. Each square told a story: blue cotton from Sarah's outgrown dress, yellow calico from curtains Martha had made for their old room, red flannel from Thomas's work shirt that she'd finally found courage to repurpose. The quilt represented everything Martha could give her daughter: warmth, protection, and the tangible proof that someone loved her enough to spend countless evening hours creating beauty from remnants. Dawnlight filtered through the small window as Dr. Morrison finished his examination, his weathered hands gentle as he checked Sarah's throat and listened to her breathing. The physician had arrived with Elias Boone just after sunrise, both men dust-covered and exhausted from their midnight ride, but alert with purpose that transcended fatigue. The fever's broken, Dr. Morrison announced, his voice carrying relief that made Martha's knees weak with gratitude. It wasn't scarlet fever, just a severe throat infection that responded well to the medicine I brought. Martha sank into the bedside chair, tears flowing freely for the first time since Sarah had taken ill. The terror of the past day dissolved into thanksgiving so complete that she couldn't speak, could only watch her daughter's peaceful breathing and marvel at the simple miracle of crisis averted. Boone stood in the doorway, his face showing exhaustion and something deeper, the particular weariness of someone who'd faced old demons and found them less powerful than expected. He'd ridden hard through mountain passes that held memories of another child's fever, another midnight vigil, another desperate search for help that had come too late. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Morrison continued, gathering his instruments with practiced efficiency. "Keep her resting for a few more days. Plenty of fluids and light meals when her appetite returns." "Thank you," Martha managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." "I don't know how to no need," the doctor interrupted kindly. "Mister." Boone explained the situation. "Any child in this community has access to medical care as needed. His instructions were quite clear on that point." The statement revealed another layer of Boone's commitment to Hollow Ridge, extending beyond charity to the systematic rebuilding of services that made communities sustainable. Martha looked at him with new understanding, recognizing that his vision encompassed not just individual assistance, but the infrastructure necessary for long-term prosperity. Sarah stirred on her pillow, her fever-bright eyes focusing on the adults gathered around her bed. "Mr. Boone," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady, "did you really ride all night to bring the doctor?" "Thunder and I thought you might need some help," Boone replied, settling carefully on the bed's edge. He was quite insistent about it. The gentle fiction brought a weak smile to Sarah's face, and Martha felt her heart expand with affection for this man, who understood how to comfort children without diminishing their intelligence. He spoke to Sarah as a person worthy of truth, presented kindly, not as someone to be protected from reality through elaborate deceptions. "I was scared," Sarah admitted with the honesty children showed when weakness made pretense impossible. "I thought I might die like Daddy did." The confession pierced Martha's heart, revealing fears her daughter had carried silently rather than adding to her mother's burdens. 8-year-old wisdom that understood death's reality while hoping for protection from those who loved her. "Being scared is natural," Boone said simply. "But you are surrounded by people who won't let anything bad happen if they can prevent it. Sometimes that's enough." Dr. Morrison departed with promises to check on Sarah's progress in a week, leaving Martha and Boone alone with their relief and the quiet intimacy that crisis created between people who'd faced fear together. Sarah had drifted back to sleep, her breathing easy and natural under the quilt that had become a symbol of maternal devotion. "Elias," Martha said softly, using his name again with growing comfort. "What you did last night was selfish," he interrupted, his voice carrying self-awareness that surprised her. "I needed to save her as much as you did, maybe more." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of accumulated grief. Martha studied his face in the morning light, seeing exhaustion and relief and something else, the particular peace that came from choosing courage over safety when stakes were highest. "Tell me about Catherine," she said gently. Boone was quiet. For a long moment, his eyes distant as memory called back voices silenced too soon. When he spoke, his words carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned to handle precious things without breaking them further. She was like Sarah in many ways, curious, trusting, quick to laugh. "Elizabeth and I thought we had time to teach her everything, to watch her grow and discover the world. But time isn't guaranteed, and the fever took her before we could say goodbye properly." The pain in his voice was ancient but not bitter, transformed through years of solitude into something approaching acceptance. Martha recognized the particular quality of grief that had been examined, understood, and integrated into the foundation of character rather than allowed to poison hope. Elizabeth never recovered. He continued. She blamed herself, blamed me, blamed God. The sadness consumed her until there was nothing left but mourning. I buried them 6 months apart and couldn't bear to stay where everything reminded me of what I'd lost. But you came back, Martha observed. I came home, Boone corrected. There's a difference. The distinction felt important in ways Martha was beginning to understand. Coming back suggested retreat or defeat, but coming home implied choice and commitment to building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Why now? She asked. Boone considered the question while watching Sarah sleep, her small hand curled around Thunder in unconscious trust. Because I finally learned that running from grief doesn't heal it, only transforms it into regret. And because some chances for redemption don't announce themselves clearly. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, like a child's hunger or a mother's love or a stranger's opportunity to choose connection over isolation. The words resonated with Martha's own understanding of how life offered second chances through unexpected doorways. She had been so focused on protecting herself and Sarah from disappointment that she'd almost missed recognizing grace when it appeared wearing work clothes and carrying ancient sorrow transformed into present generosity. The legal documents spread across Mayor Thompson's desk like autumn leaves yellowed property deeds, loan agreements, and foreclosure notices that told the hidden story of Hollow Ridge's survival over the past 2 decades. Each paper bore the same signature in careful script: Elias Boone, with dates stretching back to his mysterious disappearance and continuing through years when the town believed he'd abandoned them forever. Martha stared at the papers with growing understanding and dismay, her morning coffee cooling untouched as the scope of deception revealed itself. She'd come to the mayor's office to discuss expanding the charitable food program, only to discover that the man she was falling in love with owned practically everything she could see from the window. I don't understand, she said quietly, though. Understanding was exactly what was dawning with uncomfortable clarity. These show Mr. Boone holding mortgages on damn near every business and half the homes in town, Mayor Thompson finished grimly. His weathered face showed the strain of keeping secrets that had grown heavier with each passing year. Been that way since 1885, when the bank failed and folks couldn't make their payments. The revelation hit Martha like cold water, washing away the warmth of trust she'd been building toward Boone. You mean he's been the landlord this entire time? While people struggled and went hungry, he— Now hold on, Thompson interrupted, raising a gnarled hand. It ain't what you're thinking. When the bank collapsed, Boone could have foreclosed on every property, taken ownership of the whole town legal-like. Instead, he's been paying taxes, maintaining buildings, and letting folks stay without collecting rent. The explanation should have brought comfort, but Martha felt only the sting of betrayal by omission. How many conversations had they shared about the town's struggles, about families losing their homes, about the desperate need for economic stability? All while he held the power to solve every problem with a stroke of his pen, but chose instead to let her believe in his spontaneous generosity. Does he plan to foreclose now? She asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in her chest. Thompson shook his head slowly. Says he wants to deed everything back to the original owners, free and clear. That's why he asked me to prepare these papers transfer documents to return property to folks who've been living on his charity without knowing it. The mayor gestured toward a second stack of documents, these ones crisp and new, bearing legal language that would restore ownership to families who thought they'd lost everything years ago. The gesture was magnificent in its scope and generosity, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that such massive deception made every interaction feel calculated rather than genuine. Why didn't he tell us? The question emerged more as pain than curiosity. Why let us think we were accepting help from someone who barely knew us? Maybe, Thompson suggested gently, because he knew how proud folks are in this town. Maybe because charity feels different when it comes from your landlord versus a stranger trying to make amends. The psychology made sense, but didn't ease Martha's sense of betrayal. She thought of Sarah's innocent delight in Boone's attention, of her own growing feelings for a man who'd seemed to appear like an answer to prayers. Now those emotions felt manipulated, shaped by a relationship built on fundamental dishonesty about power and obligation. "There's more," Thompson added reluctantly, producing another document from his desk drawer. "This one concerns you directly." Martha's hands trembled as she read the deed transfer for the small house behind the church, where she and Sarah had been living. The property had belonged to Boone for 15 years, acquired when the church couldn't maintain both buildings after their congregation dwindled. He was prepared to deed it to her free and clear, along with a plot of land suitable for a garden dot. The generosity was overwhelming, but it also meant that every moment of security she'd felt in her new home had been illusory. She'd been living in his house, taking his money, falling in love with her landlord while believing herself to be an independent woman, accepting help from an equal. "I need to see him," Martha said, standing abruptly. "I need to understand why he couldn't trust us with the truth." Thompson nodded sympathetically. "He's at the old railroad office, going through more papers with his lawyer from Denver. Martha, he's a good man trying to do right by people. Maybe the method was wrong, but the heart behind it is genuine." The defense fell flat against Martha's anger and hurt. Good intentions didn't excuse treating the entire town like children who couldn't handle adult realities. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of growing intimacy had been shadowed by this massive deception that made her question everything she thought she knew about his character. She found Boone exactly where Thompson had indicated, surrounded by legal documents and speaking quietly with a well-dressed man who could only be his attorney. The scene reinforced her sense of manipulation. Here was the wealthy businessman she'd never been allowed to see, making decisions that affected everyone in town while maintaining the pretense of being just another concerned citizen. "Martha," Boone said, rising immediately when she entered, "I wasn't expecting to see me before you finished arranging everyone's lives without their knowledge." She interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made the lawyer glance nervously between them. Understanding dawned across Boone's features, followed by resignation and something that might have been relief. "Thompson showed you the documents." 20 years, Martha said, anger finally breaking through her careful control. 20 years you've owned half this town, and you let us struggle and worry and think we were one missed payment away from losing everything. How could you do that to people who trusted you? "Because I didn't want gratitude for something I should have done 20 years ago," Boone replied quietly. "Because charity from a landlord feels different than help from a friend. Because I needed you to choose me for who I am, not what I own." The explanation carried truth that Martha wasn't ready to hear. Her sense of betrayal ran deeper than logic could touch, rooted in years of careful self-reliance that had been undermined by discovering she'd been living on someone else's charity all along. "You made me feel like a beggar," she whispered, the words carrying pain that surprised them both. "All this time, I thought I was building something independent, something earned. Instead, I was just another tenant you were helping out of guilt." "That's not true," Boone said firmly, stepping toward her despite the lawyer's presence. "What happened between us, what's happening with Sarah, that has nothing to do with property or money. That's real, Martha. That's the only thing in my life that's felt real in 20 years." But Martha was already moving toward the door, her mind spinning with implications and embarrassment. How many people knew the truth? How long had she been walking through town as the object of pity rather than respect? How much of Sarah's delight in their new circumstances was based on security that could be withdrawn at any moment? "I need time to think," she said without looking back. "I need to figure out what's true and what's just another piece of theater designed to make you feel better about the past." The accusation landed hard, and Boone didn't try to follow her into the street. Martha walked home through a town that suddenly felt foreign, wondering if she'd ever known anything real about the man she'd been prepared to trust with her heart. The original town charter lay spread across the church altar like a sacred text, its handwritten clauses faded but still legible after 43 years of guiding Hollow Ridge's governance. Reverend Mills had retrieved it from the church archives at Mayor Thompson's request, and now the community's founding document served as the centerpiece for the most important meeting in the towns. History.word had spread through Hollow Ridge with the speed that only significant news could achieve in small communities. By evening, every adult in town crowded into the church pews, their faces showing mixtures of confusion, hope, and wariness as they waited to learn what Elias Boone's return truly meant for their future. Martha sat in the back row with Sarah beside her, the little girl clutching thunder while sensing the tension that rippled through adult conversations around them. 3 days had passed since Martha's confrontation with Boone. 3 days of careful avoidance and sleepless nights spent questioning everything she thought she understood about trust and independence. Boone stood at the front of the church beside Mayor Thompson, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he faced the community that had shaped him and that he'd inadvertently controlled for 20 years. The legal documents from Denver lay in neat stacks on a table borrowed from the church social hall, each pile representing families who would learn tonight whether their homes had been theirs all along or merely borrowed time. "Folks," Mayor Thompson began, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in local government, "I expect most of you have heard rumors about property ownership and Mr. Boone's involvement in keeping this town afloat. Tonight, we're here to address those rumors directly and make some important decisions about our future." A murmur rippled through the congregation as neighbors exchanged glances and shifted in seats worn smooth by generations of Sunday services. Henry and Clara Miller sat together in their usual pew, hands clasped with the unity of couples who'd weathered storms together. The Henderson family occupied an entire row, their children listening with the solemn attention that small towns taught early. Widow Spencer, never one to avoid difficult conversations, stood immediately. "Before anyone says anything else, I want to know if it's true that Mr. Boone has been our landlord all this time without telling us." The directness of the question focused every eye on Boone, who nodded slowly. "It's true, Mrs. Spencer. When the bank failed in 1885, I purchased the outstanding mortgage to prevent foreclosure. You've all been living in your homes by my choice, though I hoped you'd never need to know that." The admission sent another wave of whispers through the church, reactions ranging from gratitude to indignation. Martha watched faces around her, seeing her own complex emotions reflected in expressions that couldn't decide between appreciation and anger. Why? The question came from young Jim Henderson, whose family had struggled to maintain their farm for 15 years. "Why keep it secret if you were helping us?" Boone was quiet for a moment, choosing words with the care of someone who understood their weight. "Because charity and debt feel different than independence. Because I wanted you to build your lives based on your own choices, not gratitude to me. Because I was a coward who couldn't face the community I'd abandoned when you needed me most." The honesty in his response settled something in the room's atmosphere. This wasn't the polished speech of a politician, but the raw confession of a man who'd spent 20 years examining his own failures. Reverend Mills stepped forward, his gentle voice carrying pastoral authority. "Mr. Boone has asked to address the community about his intentions going forward. I believe we should listen before making judgments about past actions." Boone moved to the center of the altar, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. 20 years ago, I left this town when grief made staying impossible. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was really abandoning the people who'd raised me and supported my dreams." His eyes found Martha in the back row, holding her gaze briefly before continuing. I've spent those years learning that running from responsibility doesn't heal pain. It just transforms it into regret. I came back to make amends, but I've discovered something more important. I came back to come home. The distinction resonated through the church with quiet power, the difference between retreat and return becoming clear in ways that touched hearts. Accustomed to understanding life's deeper meanings, tonight, I'm offering to deed every piece of property back to its original owners. Free and clear, Boone continued, gesturing toward the legal documents. No payments, no obligations, no strings attached. Your homes, your businesses, your land, all of it becomes yours completely. The magnitude of the offer created silence so profound that Sarah's whispered question to her mother carried clearly through the church. "Mama, does this mean we get to keep our house?" The child's innocent hope broke something in the room's tension, reminding everyone that these decisions affected more than pride or principle. They determined children's futures and family security. But before anyone could respond to the offer, the church door opened with a bang that made everyone turn. 3 men in expensive suits entered without invitation, their presence immediately shifting the room's energy from hopeful to wary. "Excuse the interruption," said the tallest of the strangers, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm James Hardwell, representing the Colorado Mountain Railroad Company. I understand you're having discussions about property ownership." Mayor Thompson stood slowly, his face showing the wariness of small-town officials who'd learned to distrust outsiders bearing corporate credentials. "This is a private community meeting, Mr. Hartwell, unless you have business here." "Oh, we have business," Hartwell interrupted smoothly. "Specifically, we're here to make an offer for the entire township. The railroad is prepared to purchase all properties in Hollow Ridge for development purposes." The announcement hit the gathering like a physical blow, suddenly reframing every discussion about ownership and independence. If Boone deeded the properties back to residents, they'd have the right to sell to the railroad. If he retained ownership, he could make that decision himself. "What kind of development?" Henry Miller asked, his baker's instincts recognizing threats to community stability. "A modern depot and supply center," Hartwell replied with practiced enthusiasm. "Jobs for some of your people, compensation for all property owners, and integration into the growing railroad network. Progress, gentlemen and ladies." The future. Martha felt cold certainty settle in her chest as she understood the implications. Railroad development would transform Hollow Ridge from a community into a company town, displacing families to make room for industry and destroying the connections that made small-town life meaningful. Sarah tugged at her mother's sleeve, confusion clear in her young voice. "Mama, what does that mean for Thunder and me?" The question crystallized everything at stake, not just property or money, but the kind of community where children could grow up surrounded by people who knew their names and cared about their futures. "It means," Martha said quietly, standing as decision solidified in her heart, "that we need to choose what matters most." She walked forward through the church aisle, every eye following her progress toward the front where Boone waited. Their personal conflict seemed small against the larger threat to everything they'd all built together, separately but connected. "Mr. Boone," she said formally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church, "I think we need to talk about more than property deeds. We need to talk about home." The words acknowledged both their personal relationship and the larger community question, bridging individual hearts and collective future in ways that would determine not just who owned what, but what kind of place Hollow Ridge would become. Behind her, the railroad representatives waited with barely concealed impatience, while around her, neighbors held their breath for decisions that would echo through generations of children not yet born. The voting box sat on the altar like a sacred vessel, its worn wooden surface bearing scratches from 40 years of democratic decisions that had shaped Hollow Ridge's destiny. Mayor Thompson had retrieved it from the town hall specifically for this moment, understanding that some choices required the solemn ritual of formal democracy rather than the casual consensus of ordinary meetings. James Hartwell stepped forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to purchasing whatever he desired. His leather portfolio, containing contracts that could transform the struggling community into a profitable enterprise overnight. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be clear about our offer. The Colorado Mountain Railroad is prepared to pay fair market value plus 20% for all properties. In Hollow Ridge, that's more money than most of you have seen in your lifetimes. The sum he named caused audible gasps throughout the church. For families who'd struggled through years of economic hardship, the railroad's offer represented financial security beyond their wildest dreams, enough money to relocate anywhere, buy better homes, start fresh with advantages their children had never known. But Martha stood firm at the front of the church, her decision crystallizing as she faced the choice between individual prosperity and community preservation. Mr. Hartwell, your offer sounds generous, but you're asking us to sell more than property. You're asking us to sell our home. With respect, Mrs. Caldwell, Hartwell replied smoothly, sentiment doesn't pay bills or educate children. Our development will bring jobs, infrastructure, and economic opportunity to a region that's been bypassed by progress. Progress toward what? Martha challenged, her voice carrying the strength that adversity had forged in her character. Toward turning neighbors into strangers? Toward replacing families with workers? Toward erasing the connections that make a place worth living in? Widow Spencer stood slowly, her arthritic hands gripping the pew as she found her voice. I've lived in this town for 73 years. I buried my husband in soil that knows our names. You can't buy that with railroad money, no matter how much you offer. Her words triggered a wave of responses from throughout the congregation. Henry Miller spoke of recipes passed down through generations, of customers who were friends before they were business. Clara talked about children she'd watched grow up, marry, and raise families of their own. The Henderson family described fields that held their father's sweat and their grandfather's hopes. But other voices emerged too. Practical concerns from people who understood that sentiment couldn't repair roofs or buy medicine. Young Jim Henderson's wife spoke of opportunities for their children that small-town life couldn't provide. Others mentioned the struggle of maintaining community when economic reality drove families away one by one. We're dying slowly anyway, said Tom Parker, whose general store barely turned profit anymore. At least the railroad offers dignified exit instead of gradual abandonment. The division created visible tension in the church. Families looking at each other with new understanding of how differently they viewed their shared circumstances. Some saw heritage worth preserving. Others saw limitations worth escaping. Elias Boone had remained silent through the debate, watching faces that reflected his own internal struggle between honoring the past and embracing change. Now he stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority earned through years of examining difficult choices. Mr. Hartwell, you're offering to buy property, but you can't purchase what really matters here. You can't buy the way Mrs. Spencer checks on sick neighbors. You can't buy the way Henry Miller extends credit when families struggle. You can't buy the way children grow up, knowing they're surrounded by people who love them. Hartwell's smile remained professional, but grew strained. Mr. Boone, with respect, nostalgia doesn't create jobs or build futures. The railroad offers concrete benefits, steady employment, modern conveniences, connection to larger markets. And the cost? Boone asked quietly. Progress always requires sacrifice, Hartwell replied with practiced ease. Sometimes communities must change to survive. Sometimes, Boone agreed, but not always, and not necessarily in ways that destroy what made them worth saving in the first place. He turned to face the congregation, his weathered hands steady as he spoke from the heart that had taken 20 years to heal. I made mistakes that drove me from this community. And I spent those years learning that prosperity without connection is just comfortable loneliness. Money can't replace the bonds that make life meaningful. Sarah tugged at her mother's skirt, her child's voice cutting through adult complexities with simple clarity. Mama, if we take the railroad money, where would Thunder live? Would he still have friends to play with? The innocent question crystallized everything at stake in ways that financial arguments couldn't touch. This wasn't just about property values or economic opportunity. It was about preserving the kind of place where children's questions mattered more than corporate. Prophets. Mayor Thompson approached the voting box with ceremonial gravity, understanding that this decision would echo through generations. Citizens of Hollow Ridge, we have two choices before us: Mr. Hartwell's railroad development or Mr. Boone's property transfer with community preservation. Each adult resident gets one vote. The decision requires a simple majority. The moment had arrived when principles would be tested against practical needs, when individual dreams would be weighed against collective heritage, when the soul of Hollow Ridge would be determined by the courage of its people to choose their own destiny. The wedding dress had belonged to Martha's mother, carefully preserved in lavender and tissue paper for 28 years of waiting for the right moment to emerge from its cedar chest. Now it lay spread across Martha's bed like a promise of new beginnings, its ivory lace still beautiful despite the passage of time, representing the courage to love again despite the risks that accompanied opening one's heart. The vote had concluded an hour ago with a decision that surprised no one who truly understood Hollow Ridge's character. 27 votes for community preservation, 8 for railroad development, a clear mandate for maintaining the connections. That made their town worth saving despite the financial sacrifice such choice required. James Hartwell had departed with professional disappointment, his contracts unsigned, and his corporate vision of progress rejected by people who understood that some things couldn't be purchased. But his parting words carried ominous weight. The railroad would find other routes, other opportunities, and Hollow Ridge would remain forgotten by the prosperity that bypassed communities unwilling to embrace change. The warning had sobered even the celebration, reminding everyone that choosing heritage over money meant accepting continued struggle in a world that rewarded different values. But as neighbors had embraced and children had cheered, the decision felt right in ways that transcended practical concerns. Now Martha faced a different kind of choice. As she studied her mother's dress and contemplated the proposal Elias Boone had whispered during the community celebration, he'd asked her to marry him with the same quiet certainty that had driven his decision to return home, offering partnership rather than rescue, companionship rather than charity. "Mama," Sarah said from the doorway, thunder prancing in her small hands, "are you going to wear Grandmama's dress to marry Mr. Boone?" The directness of the question made Martha smile despite her nervousness. Sarah had listened to the adults, careful conversations, and reached conclusions with the clarity that children brought to complicated situations. "Would you like me to?" Martha asked, settling on the bed beside her daughter. "I think Daddy would want you to be happy," Sarah replied with 8-year-old wisdom that sometimes surpassed adult understanding. "And Mr. Boone makes you smile the way you used to smile before Daddy got sick." The observation touched Martha's heart with its accuracy and generosity. Thomas would indeed want her happiness, would want Sarah to grow up with a father figure who understood the value of family bonds and community connections. A gentle knock interrupted their conversation, and Martha opened the door to find Boone standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and uncertainty in his eyes. Despite the community's acceptance of his property transfer and their rejection of the railroad offer, personal forgiveness remained a separate question that required individual resolution. "Martha," he said quietly, "I know I hurt you with my deception. I know trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But I'd like the chance to try, if you're willing." She studied his face in the evening light, seeing weariness and hope, and the particular vulnerability of someone who'd learned that love required risk, despite the possibility of loss. The anger she'd carried for days had transformed into understanding during the community meeting, watching him choose their town's welfare over easier options. "Elias," she said, using his name with growing comfort, "I've been thinking about trust and what it means. You kept the truth about property ownership from us, but you never lied about your feelings or your commitment to making things right." "Those feelings are real," he assured her, stepping closer with careful hope. "Whatever happens between us, that won't change." Sarah appeared at Martha's side. Thunder clutched against her chest as she studied the adults with serious attention. "Mr. Boone, if you marry Mama, will you teach me to carve horses like Thunder?" The question brought a smile to Boone's weathered features, the first genuine happiness Martha had seen from him since their confrontation. "I'd be honored to teach you anything you'd like to learn, little one. And will you love Mama the way Daddy did?" The child's directness created a moment of profound stillness as Boone knelt to Sarah's level, his voice gentle but certain as he answered, "I'll love her differently than your daddy did, because every love is unique. But I'll love her completely, and I'll love you as if you were my own daughter, if you'll let me." Sarah considered this with the solemn thoughtfulness that important decisions required, then nodded slowly. "Thunder says that would be good." Martha felt tears threatening as she watched this man who'd lost everything find healing through the willingness to love again. The community had chosen preservation over profit, but she faced a more personal choice between safety and the courage to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying weight of commitment and hope. Yes to teaching Sarah to carve. Yes to loving completely. Yes to building a family together. Boone stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers as he spoke the words that would transform 3 separate lives into one shared future. "Martha Caldwell, will you marry me?" "Yes, Elias Boone, I will." The acceptance felt like coming home in ways that had nothing to do with property deeds or community votes. Everything to do with hearts that had learned to choose love over fear, despite the risks that accompanied such courage. The new family portrait sat on the mantelpiece of the house Elias and Martha now shared, a photograph taken on their wedding day 6 months after the town meeting that had changed everything. In the image, Boone stood tall beside Martha in her mother's ivory dress, while Sarah beamed between them holding Thunder and wearing a crown of wildflowers that had been her own idea. The photograph captured not just 3 people, but the healing power of love that transforms loss into hope and strangers into family. Spring had returned to Hollow Ridge with particular abundance, as if the land itself celebrated the community's choice to preserve what mattered most. The main street bustled with activity that hadn't been seen in 20 years. New families drawn by word of a town where neighbors cared for each other, where children could grow up knowing they belonged to something larger than themselves. Martha stood in the doorway of Miller's Bakery, now officially managed by her charitable foundation, but still carrying the warmth and welcome that Henry and Clara had built over decades of service. The morning rush included familiar faces and new ones. The Patterson family who'd moved from Denver seeking small-town values for their children. The retired schoolteacher who'd chosen Hollow Ridge for her golden years. The young couple who'd opened a bookshop in the building that once housed Tom Parker's struggling general store. Mrs. Boone called Mrs. Henderson from across the street, her voice carrying joy that had replaced years of worry about her family's security. "Sarah's getting so tall. She'll be as beautiful as her mama before we know it." The compliment brought a smile to Martha's face as she watched her daughter, now legally adopted by Elias and officially Sarah Caldwell Boone race, through the streets with her school friends, Thunder still clutched in her hand despite his worn appearance. At 9 years old, Sarah had blossomed into a confident child who understood that she was loved by 2 fathers, one who watched over her from heaven, and one who taught her to carve Horses from blocks of pine. Elias emerged from the bank where he'd been meeting with investors, interested in supporting Hollow Ridge's growth without compromising its character. The railroad's departure had opened opportunities for different kinds of development, sustainable tourism, artisan crafts, and the kind of businesses that enhance community life rather than replacing it. How did the meeting go? Martha asked as he approached, automatically straightening his tie with the unconscious intimacy of marriage. Better than expected, he replied, drawing her close with an arm around her waist. The Denver group wants to fund expansion of the school and establish a scholarship program for local children. They understand we're not interested in becoming a corporate town. The news represented exactly the kind of progress Hollow Ridge needed: investment that strengthened rather than transformed. Growth that preserved rather than erased the connections that made their community special. "Mama, Papa!" Sarah's voice carried across the street as she raced toward them, her school bag bouncing against her hip. The title Papa had emerged naturally after the adoption, chosen by Sarah herself as perfect for the man who'd become her father through love rather than blood. "What is it, sweetheart?" Martha asked as Sarah skidded to a stop before them, breathless with excitement. "Mrs. Henderson says there's a new family coming to town with a little girl my age. They're moving into the house by the church, and they have a dog named Biscuit." The enthusiasm in Sarah's voice captured everything beautiful about childhood in small towns. The assumption that new neighbors meant new friends. That community would embrace newcomers with the same warmth they'd always shown to those who belonged. "That's wonderful news," Elias said, ruffling Sarah's hair with gentle affection. "Perhaps we should prepare a welcome basket for them." "With cookies," Sarah added immediately. "And maybe a wooden horse for the little girl, if she'd like one." The suggestion touched Martha's heart with its echo of generosity learned through example. Sarah had absorbed the lessons of community care that surrounded her daily, understanding instinctively that welcome meant action rather than words. They walked together toward home, a family created through choice and commitment rather than chance, moving through streets where every face held familiarity and every building told stories of survival and renewal. The afternoon light caught the fresh paint on storefronts, the new playground equipment behind the school, the garden plots where families grew vegetables and flowers with equal care. As they reached their front porch, another family approached from the direction of the church, a man and woman with a little girl who clutched a doll with the same devotion Sarah showed Thunder. The newcomers looked uncertain, overwhelmed by the transition that moving always created, especially when leaving familiar places for unknown communities. Martha recognized the expression immediately, the mixture of hope and worry that accompanied life's major changes. The question of whether new places could become home through time and investment. "Welcome to Hollow Ridge," she called, approaching with the natural warmth that had made her perfect for managing community outreach. "I'm Martha Boone, and this is my husband Elias and our daughter Sarah." "Thank you," the woman replied with visible relief at finding immediate friendliness. "I'm Rebecca Walsh, and this is my husband James and our daughter Emma. We're moving into the house behind the church." "The very best house in town?" Elias said with gentle humor. "We lived there ourselves when we were starting over." Emma peered shyly from behind her mother's skirt, her eyes finding Sarah with the cautious interest that children showed potential friends. Sarah stepped forward with confidence born from security, offering Thunder for inspection. "This is Thunder," she said seriously. "My papa carved him from magic wood that helps horses talk to people who listen carefully." The introduction worked its intended magic, drawing smiles from the adults and fascinating attention from Emma, who examined Thunder with the reverence appropriate to such important introductions. "Would you like to see my room?" Sarah asked. "And maybe help me plan a party for Thunder's birthday next week." As the children moved toward the house, already deep in conversation about wooden horses and birthday celebrations, Martha and Elias exchanged looks that carried the satisfaction of witnessing Community in action, the natural process by which newcomers became neighbors, strangers became friends, and scattered individuals became family through the simple courage to care about each other's well-being. The cycle would continue as long as people chose connection over isolation, generosity over selfishness, and the hard work of building community over the easy comfort of remaining strangers. In Hello Ridge, that choice had been made, not just by 3 people who'd found love through loss, but by everyone who understood that home was something created daily through countless small acts of kindness and acceptance. The new family portrait would need updating soon? Martha realized, as their circle expanded to include all the hearts that had chosen to belong to something larger than themselves.